The thunder of hooves shook the ground like an endless storm, dust rising to blur the horizon as dozens of wild horses tore across the plain toward the makeshift market on the town's edge, where merchants shouted orders and people scattered for safety. In the midst of the chaos, a pale-faced young woman stumbled hard onto the packed earth, her cry swallowed by neighs and screams as the crowd shoved her down. Her hands clawed for something to hold, but all she found was the white kerchief she had tied around her neck to guard against dust. And as she fell, she clutched it tight, as if that scrap of cloth could save her. The crowd shrieked at her to move, shouting that no one could halt such a stampede, and some even laughed cruelly as they saw her left behind before the oncoming tide of pounding bodies. Time collapsed into a single instant. The young woman closed her eyes, bracing for hooves to crush her, and the kerchief slipped from her hand, drifting upward like a white flag of surrender. Then, from the edge, a rider burst into the madness with a mastery that seemed impossible. His long hair whipped beneath the leather band that bound it, his dark eyes locked solely on her, as though no other path existed but to reach her in time. He was a Dakota warrior, astride a chestnut horse that answered every tug of rein with fierce precision. In one swift motion, the warrior leaned from the saddle, his strong arm shooting down to seize her, lifting her from the ground in mid-gallop and holding her tight against his chest, while hooves hammered all around like iron mallets. The crowd gasped as the stampede closed behind them, yet the rider did not falter, driving through until he broke free on the far side of the market, where dust thinned and the roar of hooves faded into the distance. Trembling in his arms, the young woman struggled to grasp what had just happened, and saw with awe that in the warrior's hand was not only her, but also her kerchief, caught in the same saving gesture. He raised it for a moment before all, and it seemed no mere scrap of cloth, but a testament that even the frailest thing could endure the fury of the herd. The silence that followed was not relief, but disbelief, for none had expected a so-called savage to risk his life amid a storm of horses to save a stranger. The young woman was still gasping against the Dakota warrior's chest when his horse skidded to a halt, snorting fiercely as its hooves tore the dust from the ground. The hush that had followed the thunder broke into a swelling murmur. Some clapped hesitantly, others pointed in anger, and several shouted that it was not right for a savage to burst into the square as if master of life and death. A sharp-faced woman selling cloth at a nearby stall shrieked that everyone had seen the girl fall because of her own clumsiness, and now the Dakota held her as though she were some prize. A man in a dust-caked hat shouted that the white kerchief the warrior raised was no symbol of salvation, but of shame, for no Indian had any right to display such a thing before a civilized town. Trembling, the young woman tried to pull away from his arms, but the rider did not release her yet. He held her firmly, as if he knew the ground was still unsafe. Children who had fled to hide in the market now peeked out with wide eyes, not understanding why the grown-ups shouted against the man who had braved a stampede to save a life. The kerchief, now lifted high in the Dakota's hand, rippled in the breeze like an unexpected banner. And that detail unleashed new jeers. "A rag doesn't change what you are," a merchant cried, while others laughed bitterly. The young woman pressed her lips together, tears rising, not from the rescue, but from the cruelty of those who would rather see her dead than thankful to an Indian. Without a word, the warrior lowered her gently to the ground, setting her on her feet before them all, and then extended the kerchief toward her, placing it in her hands as one might pass down a testimony. For a moment no one spoke, until the market chief, a broad man in an embroidered vest, stepped forward. His voice dripping with venom. "That kerchief is already stained by his hands. If you keep it, you will carry the disgrace of us all." The crowd roared in division, some nodding, others falling into uneasy silence, and the young woman felt that the weight of that piece of cloth in her fingers was heavier than any chain. The young woman pressed the kerchief against her chest, her trembling fingers streaked with dust, while the murmur of the crowd grew ever more hostile. A woman shouted that she must throw it to the ground before the whole town was cursed, and an old man, his voice heavy with scorn, declared it would have been better for her to die beneath the hooves than owe gratitude to a savage. The market chief stepped forward again, his embroidered vest glinting beneath the sun, raising his hand as if he were already judge and executioner. "That rag does not belong to you, nor does the dignity of this town. Surrender it, or be cast out." The young woman, her face streaked with tears, turned her eyes to the Dakota warrior, searching for an answer, as though her life depended not on the cloth itself, but on the strength with which he had lifted her from the ground. His silence had been a wall until that moment, but now, with the entire square watching, he parted his lips, and his deep voice cut through the air. "That kerchief is not stained. It is alive. I carried it in my hands because she had to go on breathing." The crowd erupted in shouts, some calling his words insolence, others murmuring that perhaps it was true, for they had all seen how the stampede had nearly dragged her into death. The market chief clenched his fists, enraged that he could not silence a voice that commanded respect even among those who despised him, and he roared that the sheriff must be called, that no foreigner could be allowed to dictate what was honor or shame. The children who had watched the rescue began whispering among themselves, pointing at the white kerchief now freed of dust, and those innocent voices, though faint, planted doubt in the hearts of the adults. The young woman lifted the kerchief with both hands, as though to show it to everyone, and the breeze made it ripple again, gleaming beneath the noonday sun. A hush rippled through the square, for what had seemed a mere scrap of cloth now felt like a banner of life against hatred. The market chief bellowed with fury and called for his men, ordering them to seize the kerchief before the people forgot who ruled that square. The market men pushed forward at the order, shoving through the crowd with elbows and shouts, and the young woman instinctively stepped back, clutching the kerchief to her chest, as if that scrap of cloth were a shield against invisible knives. The Dakota warrior stepped in front of her, his shadow falling over her, and the air in the square grew tight enough to hurt. The first to lunge was a broad-shouldered youth with his shirt hanging open. He reached out to tear the kerchief away, but the warrior's hand caught his wrist mid-air, twisting it with a sharp motion until the man dropped to his knees, crying out in pain. Another tried circling from the side, and without releasing the girl, the Dakota blocked him with a crushing shove of his shoulder, sending him crashing into a fruit stall, oranges and apples scattering across the ground like an explosion of color in the dust. The crowd shrieked in division, some demanding he be driven out, others whispering that it was unjust to fight against the one who had saved a life. The market chief thundered that the kerchief was a disgrace, that if the woman kept it, the whole town would be branded as weak, his arms flailing like a frenzied preacher. The young woman, tears streaming down her cheeks, raised the cloth higher, as if to show she would not let it go, even as fear burned in her chest. The warrior met her eyes for an instant, then turned his gaze on the crowd, his deep voice resounding. "If you want to tear that kerchief away, you will have to go through me." The murmur died at once, as though those words had set a wall of stone before them. But the market chief, red with rage, lifted a heavy staff and shouted that he would not allow a savage to defy him in his own square, charging forward with the intent to strike. The crowd held its breath, for what was about to unfold was not merely a fight for a piece of cloth, but a public trial where the town's honor would be weighed against the dignity of a kerchief held in trembling hands. The market chief's staff came crashing down with fury, set to split the air and the pride of the Dakota warrior, but it was stopped cold by a cry that sliced through the square like a knife. Stop! That kerchief is no common rag." Every gaze turned toward the voice, and from the crowd emerged a bent old woman, her white hair pinned beneath a dark veil, shuffling forward on unsteady yet determined steps toward the heart of the turmoil. Her trembling hands lifted as she pointed to the kerchief clutched against the young woman's chest, declaring that she herself had embroidered it years ago for the landowner's wife, and that into its stitches she had sewn the secret emblem of her lineage. Silence thickened. The young woman stared in disbelief at the scrap of cloth, unable to grasp the meaning, while the market chief blanched for a heartbeat before donning once more the mask of fury. The old woman pressed closer, brushing aside the men as though they were mere shadows, and with wrinkled fingers took hold of one corner of the kerchief, showing a small embroidery hidden at its edge, barely visible beneath the grime, a figure of wheat entwined with initials. "This kerchief," she declared with a clear voice, "belonged to the lawful wife of the landowner. And she passed it in secret to her daughter. That young woman did not fall in the stampede by chance. Life brought her here to claim what is hers." The crowd erupted in shouts. Some muttered it was impossible. Others crossed themselves as though they had witnessed a miracle. Tears streamed down the young woman's face as she realized in an instant that the kerchief, despised as a rag, was in truth the proof of her blood and her right. The market chief bellowed that it was all lies, that the old woman was raving, that no one should heed a senile crone. But he could no longer erase what all had seen, a hidden symbol binding the girl to the most powerful family in the region. The Dakota warrior, tall and unwavering, took the kerchief in his hands and raised it high for all to see, as though he held not a scrap of cloth, but a banner of truth. The murmur swelled into a roar of clashing voices, the square divided in two, those still loyal to the chief, and those beginning to side with the young woman and her warrior. And in the chaos, it became clear to all that the struggle was no longer about a rescue, nor about a rag, but about a hidden legacy that could alter the fate of the entire town. The market chief, red with rage, tore the hat from his head and hurled it to the ground, stomping on it as though crushing the truth that had just been revealed. His men, stoked by his fury, began shoving through the crowd, some wielding clubs and rusted chains, shouting that it was all a fraud, that the kerchief had been embroidered by false hands, that the girl was nothing but a beggar dressed as an heir. The old woman raised her voice, defending her embroidery with the firmness of one who knows memory does not lie, but she was shoved back, nearly toppled to the ground. The young woman rushed to catch her. Pressing the kerchief to her chest, tears mingling with the new determination hardening across her face. The Dakota warrior stepped forward, his figure towering like a wall between the attackers and the two women, and his dark gaze made more than one man falter, though the chief's fury allowed no pause. "Tear it from her hands before it bewitches you all," he bellowed, and two men lunged forward, reaching for the kerchief. The warrior stopped them with a sharp motion. He seized the first by the collar and hurled him to the ground, sending him rolling through the dust, and from the second he ripped away the club, snapping it in two as though it were no more than a twig. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others roaring in outrage, until the square became a cauldron of clashing voices. The sheriff had not yet arrived, and without his authority, chaos threatened to consume everything. Then, forcing his way through the throng, came the young heir of the landowner, late to the scene, raising his voice and declaring that the embroidery was real, that he had seen the same symbol in his mother's garments, but his words were drowned in the storm of shouts and the stones that some had already begun to lift from the ground. The air reeked of violence, of stifled hatred and unleashed fear. The young woman held the kerchief high, trembling but resolute, as if that piece of cloth were her only shield, and in that gesture the crowd split more starkly than ever. one side for the chief, the other for the warrior and for her. The tension reached its peak when the market chief, driven mad, drew a long knife from his belt and roared that this farce would end in blood. The knife flashed beneath the sun like a living threat as the market chief raised it high above his head, and the crowd split back in shock, leaving an open circle in the center of the square where everything would be decided. Some shouted not to stain the sacred ground of the dead with blood. Others begged for someone to stop the madness, yet no one dared move. The air was so heavy it seemed to burn in every lung. The young woman, clutching the kerchief tight in her hands, stumbled backward until she struck the mound of earth dug from a coffin, her pale face lit by terror. The Dakota warrior advanced unhurried, but each step resounded like a war drum, his gaze locked on the man who brandished the knife with blind rage. The market chief spat onto the ground, snarling that no savage would ever decide the town's fate, and lunged forward with a downward slash meant to rip open his chest. The Dakota spun with the grace of a predator, evading the blade by a breath, and steel carved nothing but air, pulling a gasp from the crowd. The warrior seized his attacker's wrist in one hand and shoved the arm skyward with the other, forcing the chief to face the heavens. But the man fought back with the strength of hatred, gnashing his teeth like a rabid beast. The young woman cried out for them to stop, her tears soaking the kerchief she still held aloft, but no one heard her, for the whole square was holding its breath at the duel unfolding before them. The landowner's heir tried to push through, shouting that the kerchief was proof enough, but loyal men blocked his way, and his voice was swallowed in the storm of cries. With a savage wrench, the chief tore free and struck again, the knife grazing the Dakota's arm and leaving a crimson line across his skin. The crowd gasped as one, for blood had been spilled, and they knew there could be no return. The warrior, his face hardened but calm, planted his feet firmly in the earth, ready to finish what had begun, while the market chief, sweating and panting, raised the knife once more. The silence was absolute, and in it everyone understood that the next blow would decide not only the fate of the kerchief, but of the entire town. The knife came down with a deadly whistle, aimed straight for the Dakota warrior's chest. But at the precise instant, the young woman stepped between them, lifting the kerchief with both hands as though that fragile cloth could stop steel. The blade grazed its edge and halted a breath from her face when the Dakota seized the chief's wrist with brutal strength, freezing the strike in midair. The crowd held its breath, paralyzed, for what they saw was no longer just a clash of men but a symbol, a scrap of cloth suspended between life and death. The market chief thrashed like a cornered beast, snarling that the woman had no right to carry the name embroidered there, that the kerchief should be burned on the spot to erase the lie. The Dakota shoved hard, wrenching the knife downward, and with a sharp twist forced it from the man's hand, sending him stumbling to his knees in the dust, panting, humiliated. The crowd roared, split into clashing cries, some demanding justice, others calling for expulsion. But all understood it was no longer possible to feign indifference. The heir, blood on his shoulder, forced his way forward and took the kerchief from the young woman's hands, raising it high before all. His words clear and steady. "This is no rag. It is the inheritance of my blood, the memory of my mother, and the right of my sister." The silence that fell was so deep even the wind seemed to stop. The old embroideress wept with her hands clasped, and the children gazed at the kerchief as if it were a sacred banner. The market chief, defeated but unbroken, spat blood and swore that even if he lost that day, the town would never accept bastards or savages as its masters. The Dakota warrior looked at him calmly, without a word, for in his silence was more authority than in all the man's shouts. The crowd began to lean, slowly but inexorably, toward the side of the kerchief and those who held it, and in that fragile balance it was clear the next move would decide forever who held power. The market chief staggered to his feet, his face streaked with sweat and dust, his eyes burning red with a defeat he could not accept. A murmur rippled through the square as, from within his embroidered vest, he pulled a scrap of tinder and a flint, striking them with trembling hands. "If this kerchief is an inheritance, then let it burn before all," he roared, and a small flame leapt to life in his palm. The crowd screamed in horror, drawing back as they understood his intent. He no longer sought to defeat the warrior, but to destroy the very proof that tied the young woman's blood to the landowner's name. The girl cried out in despair, clutching the kerchief to her chest, while the heir fought to push his way through the crush of bodies, shouting that such an act was sacrilege. The Dakota stepped forward with steady stride, but the chief brandished the flame like a weapon, bellowing that if anyone came closer he would ignite it at once. The air thickened with dread, and all held their breath as the kerchief, fluttering in the breeze, seemed poised to become ashes in a heartbeat. The old embroideress collapsed to her knees, imploring heaven not to allow such a profanation, while some men muttered that perhaps it would be best to let it burn, to end the conflict in fire. But then a child in the crowd, too young to grasp the weight of lineage, yet not too young to feel injustice, snatched a stone from the ground and hurled it at the flint, striking it clean and snuffing the spark in an instant. The chief screamed in fury as the crowd erupted with cries, and the Dakota seized the moment, wrenching the tools from his hand and grinding the flint into the dust until it was useless. The chief struggled wildly, spitting insults and curses, but no one came to his aid. Even his own men shrank back, unwilling to be dragged into his ruin. The kerchief, still clutched in the young woman's trembling hands, waved clean and bright beneath the noonday sun, and the square felt itself witness to something far greater than a quarrel, a symbol that had endured knife, mockery, and now fire. Yet the tension did not end, for the chief, kneeling in the dirt, lifted his bloodshot eyes and swore that if he could not burn the cloth, he would make the girl pay with her life. The market chief hurled himself at the young woman with a roar of hatred, his hands curled like claws, but he never reached her. The Dakota warrior caught his arm mid-air with such force that the cry of pain echoed through the square. The crowd erupted in shouts, and this time there was no division. Men and women surged forward together, not to aid the chief, but to surround him and cast him aside like an unwanted shadow. The sheriff, who had arrived amidst the chaos, raised his voice firmly and declared that the man would stand trial for attempted murder and for betraying the written will of the landowner. None objected. The authority of the town had shifted, and power no longer belonged to fear. The chief, defeated, was dragged away amid insults and scorn, his once loud laughter drowned into silence. Then the young woman, still trembling, lifted the kerchief before them all. The cloth, stained with dust and tears, rippled in the breeze with a dignity no fire or blade had been able to destroy. The heir, his voice steady, placed his hand over hers and declared that he recognized his sister, that this garment would be the seal binding families long divided. The old embroideress wept with pride, whispering that each stitch had been a thread of destiny, and the children who had watched the rescue raised their small hands as if they too wished to touch that cloth turned into a banner. The Dakota warrior, not seeking glory, took the kerchief for a moment and laid it across the young woman's shoulders, as though enthroning her before the entire town. The silence that followed was solemn, and for the first time in that square no one dared to mock. They understood that what had begun as an accident in the Stampede had ended as a sacred act of redemption. Beneath the burning noonday sun, the young woman smiled through her tears, pressing the kerchief to her heart, and all knew that what had once been fragile had become unbreakable. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had stood before that stampede, would you have found the courage to lift the kerchief with her?